In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to make an amazing Buckleberry Ferry diorama that's a great display piece and perfect for wargaming. So it's a pretty exciting day here at Zorpazorp Studios as we are officially unveiling the first couple of terrain kits in our 28mm wargaming series. The first of which is our Ferry Master's house, which is a really nice generic looking thatch roofed fantasy house. As you can see, these are all hand carved and finished in cast resin, absolutely chock-a-block full of detail. The bottom level is fully interioured. We've got a gorgeous little window facade, timber beams, daub walls, and a stunning little chimney piece which continues up into the roof and all the way up the side of the building. We've got some stunning thatch detail and beautiful timber beam paneling as well. It's a really lovely kit. You can get it just like this over at Zorpazorp.com, or you can get a fully pre-painted version so that if you want to just grab it and chuck it straight on the table, you certainly can. And the second kit that we're bringing out today is a little jetty and ferry set. Once again, this is all hand carved. I've crunched heaps of details into this beautiful wood grain, lots of timber detail, and it's all cast and finished in polyurethane resin. We've got some little buckets and little kind of pillows for the raft to bump against, as well as a few little sexy coils of rope just to kind of really bring the whole scene to life. And the reason that I've started with these two kits is they are absolutely perfect for depicting the scene of the Buckleberry Ferry from the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring.
Get the rope stuck!
This is an absolutely fantastic scene that I really love. The hobbits fleeing before the wrath of the ringwraiths, and I really wanted to kind of make a big diorama of this for ages, and it's just such a great scene with so much kind of energy and a beautiful picturesque setting. So I thought what I'd do in this video is show you guys how we can use these two new kits to get your very own Buckleberry Ferry.
So as always, we work from the ground up and start with our baseboard. I'm going to be using 3mm MDF for this project because it's nice and thin and we don't need a lot of structural integrity because we're going to get that from the resin. So grab all of your components and start lining them up and sketching yourself out a nice little riverbank. You need to leave enough room for all of the components, particularly the ferry and the jetty, so make sure your pool is nice and wide. I've got the width of the whole piece at 2 feet because I'm going to line it up with those 1 foot river sections to make it 4 feet wide. Once you're happy, grab a jigsaw and cut it all out, and then you've got yourself a nice little baseboard. Now the first thing we want to do is grab some sandpaper and really bevel all of these MDF edges because we want this board to blend really nicely with whatever gaming surface you're playing on. So give that a good work over and get it as smooth as you can, and then it's time to build up the riverbank. So this is a sheet of extruded polystyrene that I'm just tracing out slightly smaller than the MDF itself because we want it to start to slope up from that base. So grab yourself a nice sharp knife with a really clean blade and start zigzagging away until you've got yourself a nice little piece of foam. As my piece is meeting these 2 other 1 foot river sections, I'm just going to line them up and start to work on my riverbank, making sure that my slope matches on the centerpiece with the 2 side river sections. So my riverbank is quite steep because I want to have a nice deep pool, and that does mean that I need to carve away quite a bit in this flatter section where the Ferry Master's house is going to go. Make sure you put in a little channel for your road, and we'll start to build that up with some detail later. Now, of course, we want this landform to look really natural, so the next thing we're going to do is grab our personal protective equipment and grab some sandpaper and really smooth this all back so it looks nice and even. Just work it until you're happy with the finished texture. To glue our riverbank piece to our basing board, I'm going to be using 2 glues, just a long standard form PVA for the center, and then I'm running around the edges with some Weld Bond, which is a high strength quick drying PVA, just so that I can get working on it quickly. Now while that's drying, we're just going to give all of our resin components a quick wash in warm soapy water. This gets rid of any remaining mold release agent, and that'll make sure your paint adheres beautifully to the resin. So now that our riverbank has dried, it's time to work on the riverbed. Now we're going to be doing that by melting the foam, and you can do that with 2 ways. You can either use a butane torch, like I'm messing around with there, or a heat gun. My butane torch is pretty massive, so I'm going to go with my heat gun with a nice controlled nozzle, because that's going to give me a lot of control over the parts of the foam that I'm melting. Make sure you are wearing serious personal protective equipment when you do this, masks, glasses, lots of ventilation, because these fumes are highly toxic. So you can see I'm just gently working my my way down the riverbed, melting different sections and starting to create the depth that I want and lining up my river pieces so that the riverbank joins match. Now, you can do all sorts of different techniques here. You can really burrow right down and make quite harsh slopes that look like lovely overhanging rocks and roots, or you can kind of just make a nice, gentle sloping riverbed. It's all up to you. So now it's time to prime our resin kit. I'm just going to grab some black masking tape here and block out the little window so that we don't accidentally prime all of that section brown. I'm using the Tamiya TS62 NATO brown and just give everything a nice flat even prime. For the roof, ferry and jetty, make sure you get the undersides as well. Now that our resin components are primed, it's time to start mounting them into our baseboard, starting with our ferrymaster's house. I'm just using normal PVA here because we don't need a quick seal for this, because I'm about to lock it all down with a whole bunch of multi-purpose filler. You can use any sort of filler that you have available, either sculptor mold or a plaster compound, but I'm just using this multi-purpose filler because it's what I've got in the workshop. So it's just mixed up with water, and then you apply it and smear it, and it kind of cooks off and goes hard in about 15 to 20 minutes. I'm also going to use this to blend the MDF and the foam all the way along the edges to really make that transition seamless, and you're never going to be able to tell the difference once it's all covered in static grass. Up next, we need to make sure that the ends of our riverbank are really perfectly sculpted. So grab a little bit more filler, line it up with your existing riverbank pieces if you have any, and make sure it all meets nicely, because there will be a little bit of warpage as we've melted that foam. It does buckle in a little bit. The last thing we're going to do with the filler is start to shape out our road, and this is where we get to give it a whole lot of character, mound up a bit of filler in the center of the road to make those kind of wheel ruts and those channels, and we'll cover those later with grass and really give a nice road effect. You also want to blend in the jetty and get lots of filler around those joins, but we're going to remove that and not let that set in so that we've got access to the riverbank underneath. Up next, just give the entire board a coat in stone finish or texture paint, just to really tie everything together and put all of the groundwork for the ground texture down. Once you're happy with your finished texture, give it a nice big prime so we can start to get painting. I'm using a foam-safe floral spray paint that doesn't have any solvents in it so that I don't dissolve any of the foam. So now that our prime has dried, it's time to dive into painting, and we're going to start with the riverbank. Up first, I'm going to give it quite a heavy dry brushing with some pretty warm burnt sienna, just to really warm up the midtones of the dirt colors and really bring the prime to life and give a nice sort of graduation of tone across the riverbank. I'm applying a little bit more paint to the raised areas of the bank just to start to bring those to life. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow ochre. The yellow ochre is quite a bright paint, so I'm going to use the same brush so that as I'm loading up that brush with the wet paint already on it, it starts to blend it and help already kind of tone it into the board, and I'm going to take quite a lot of paint off that before I dry brush. Make sure you're nice and light with this because you don't want to go too much, but essentially what you're doing here is providing a nice level of warmth for our final highlight, which is quite a cool bone. As always, be nice and light with your dry brushing. You don't want any brush strokes, particularly with these top brighter colors, because they'll be very obvious if you have too much paint loaded on your brush. And once you're all done, you should have a really nice grounded finish that's going to look fantastic once we put some static grass down. So now it's time to paint our resin kits, and we're going to start off by grabbing some Tuscarora fir from the Games Workshop Citadel range and apply that all over the chimney. Make sure you get it in all the nooks and crannies. This is a great time to kind of fix up if you've got any bad primes in the brick area. As you can see, there's a little bit of white there, so I'm just going to hit that with the Tuscarora fir, and obviously we want to do the chimney on the roof piece as well. Just grabbing some of that craft paint bone color we used for the dry brush, I'm going to apply that to all of the daub walls to give a real kind of base tone for us to work with. Essentially, these walls are a nice kind of daub thatch combination, and they've got a lot of texture there, but what we're going to do is put this down as a base coat first. Once that's done, it can be a little bit messy. I'm just going to grab some charred brown from Vallejo and go over all of my messy painting and clean up around all of the woodwork anywhere I've got bone on it, paying particular attention to details around the windowsill. While we're over at the window, I'm just going to grab some lead belcher from the Games Workshop Citadel range and hit all of the lead lighting to really pick out those metal details. Up next, it's time to put down the base coats for our lovely round door, and I'm going to be going for quite a warm but muted red tone, so I'm going to start with the Vallejo Game Colors Scarlet Red and applying that quite liberally all over the resin surface of the door. While that's still wet, I'm going to come in with a bit of a wet blended highlight using some red gore and just start to pick out all of the paneling, giving that a little bit more vibrancy of color, but not pushing any of it too deeply into the recesses. So now we've got all of our base coats down across the entire building, it's time to bring in our washes. This is one of the greatest steps because you'll really see the detail on the models start to pop. I'm going to be using two incredible workhorse washes from the Citadel range, of course Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. Up first, I'm going to grab Nuln Oil and just apply it over all of my brown timber surfaces. The floorboards using a nice broad flat brush, and then grabbing a smaller brush for all of my fine details on the timber paneling as well as the windowsill. Up next, I'm going to grab some Agrax Earthshade and apply that to all of the bright bone daub, and this is where you'll really start to see the detail of that daub sing. Then switching back to Nuln Oil, I'm going to apply that all over our chimney pieces, letting it really flow into the recesses of the brickwork. Once all your washes are dry, it's time to start adding all of our final detail to our layers, starting with the door walls. I'm going to grab some bone white from the Vallejo Game Colors range, and we're going to gently dry brush that all over the entire surface, really picking out the raised areas and leaving the nice shaded tones in the recesses. Quickly ducking back to our Tuscarora fur, I'm just going to give the entire brickwork a quick dry brush just to give it a little bit more vibrancy, but leaving the Nuln Oil in the recesses. Now that the Nuln Oil has really seeped into all the recessed details of our bright red door, I'm just going to return some of the vibrancy of colour with another highlight of red gore, and then do a bit of a wet blend with blood red, just to really top off that nice bright timber wood grain. Now the final step with our house is of course our thatch, so we're going to start from our prime state and get it looking a lovely nice golden thatch colour. First up, I'm going to go with some pure yellow ochre, again just using a nice craft paint, and give that a really heavy dry brushing across all of the raised detail, and then blend in a little bit of bone on the same brush and start to apply that heavily to the raised sections as well. You can do this as a kind of a wet blend dry brush, and then once that's dry, come back in with some pure bone and just hit all of the tops again, just to really crisp those nice bone highlights. So now that our house is done, it's time to work on our jetty and our raft. So up first is some heavy skin tone, which I'm going to do a nice heavy dry brush all over the beautiful wood grain, and then come in with some bone white and dry brush a nice gentle highlight across the timber surfaces. Going back to some heavy skin tone, I'm just going to pick out our two little rafting pillows, and then once that's all dry, give everything a really heavy wash in Agrax Earthshade. There's a lot of detail here, and once that Agrax Earthshade is on, that detail really sings. So now that everything is painted, it's time to start getting some grass down. So grab yourself a whole bunch of PVA and a nice heavy blotting brush and dump that all over your riverbank. I like to do small sections at a time so that you can make sure the glue stays nice and wet, and grab yourself some static grass and a static grass applicator and get a shaken. I'm using a blend of 4 and 2mm summer and spring grasses just to make sure we get a nice mottled green that doesn't look too flat or too plain. Just before I apply my static grass, I do sprinkle in a little bit of rock and gravel just to make sure that there's some nice extra details in our grassy surface. If you guys are keen for some more in-depth detail on how to apply static grass to an applicator, check the links down in the description. Now it's time to work on our riverbed. So we're going to build up the detail in this riverbed by applying a couple of series of different sizes of stones. First up, I'm going to work with a bigger stone profile, those big sort of round flat river stones which are the real basis of any riverbed. And then once I've got those to a level that I like them, I come in with a much smaller gravel and blend that all together. You can work back and forth in this layer until you've got a surface that you're happy with. So now that our stonework is done, it's time to add a little bit of life. So I'm going to grab some of these Luke's APS summer tufts from Zorpazorp.com and throw them down along the edges of the riverbank, and even a few on the riverbed itself, just to give a little bit more length of grass and a little bit of life to the entire river scene. Now that our riverbed surface is done, we can glue down our jetty. I've just thrown in a couple of extra balsa poles to act as supports. The last layer of detail for our riverbed is some reeds running along the bank. Now these are just a series of different coloured fibres that I'm blending together, a bone, a green and a reddy kind of orange, and you tie them all up in little bundles with a blob of hot glue and then throw them straight down into the riverbank. You can make these yourself out of paintbrush fibres, or you can simply buy them from companies like Woodland Scenics or Hikey. Once the tufts are all glued down, blend them in with a little bit more gravel and stonework, and that way you'll never see any of the glue. So now it's time for our water effects. Make sure you're wearing your masks, glasses and gloves, and we're going to be mixing up our water today with a 2-part epoxy resin. This particular resin mixes in a 2-to-1 ratio between A and B, so mix that all together, grab yourself a paddle pop stick or a stirrer and really beat the crap out of it until it's quite well mixed. Up next, I'm going to grab just some acrylic paint. This is the Khaki from Vallejo, and you could use acrylic paints to tint epoxy resin. It doesn't work like a proper tinter. Instead, what it does is it kind of forms a microparticulate that you can really beat up, and it looks like little bits of dirt sifting through the water and applies a really nice color. As you can see it start to go down, I'm just working really gently, applying quite close to the edges of the board. This is a great way to test for leaks. So what I'm actually going to do is do a first layer, which is probably only about 30% of the resin I'm going to put in the board, and let that cure to a certain point and see if that's going to leak at all. And then if it doesn't leak, you can come back in about an hour later and put the rest of the resin volume down, just pouring it straight in and watching it do its magic. Now you'll notice I sculpted a few kind of deeper areas by leaving kind of cavities of stone, so we get different colors throughout our pool so it doesn't look completely natural. One thing you do need to be careful of though is as it's drying, make sure you've got a completely level surface, otherwise it's all going to flow out one side and your water is going to be on a slant. Now the last thing to do is grab a paddle pop stick and go through and finish any little pesky rocks that you don't want popping up above the water, and checking your shoreline to make sure the meniscus of the resin doesn't look too unawkward. As a last little detail, I'm just going to grab a few more river stones and bits of gravel and drop them in around the entrance to our landing so that it looks like it's quite a well-traveled area. Now this 2-part epoxy will take about 3.5 hours to dry, and you just want to make sure that every now and then you do check on it and hit it with a bit of a heat gun, and that way you'll pop any bubbles that are coming to the surface and also help it cure really efficiently.
So there we have it, our finished Buckleberry Ferry diorama, and I think it looks pretty awesome. I hope you guys like it too. Remember, if you want to grab yourselves a Ferry Master's house and the ferry and jetty set, just head over to Zorpazorp.com and check out the store. We've got them all listed up there. You can get them either pre-painted or unpainted, so whether you want to just throw them down and roll some dice and get cracking, or you want to build them into a big kind of board that you're already working on, we've got you covered. Make sure you check out all the other Middle-earth SPG content we've got here on the channel, as well as all of our other terrain tutorials. If you're new around here, make sure you like the video to show us that you enjoyed it, and definitely subscribe so that you can get all of our new videos that are coming out. This isn't the only terrain set that we've got in the works. We're planning on bringing out a whole lot of extra stuff that's going to be great for fantasy, or for Lord of the Rings stuff, and all sorts of different war games. So make sure you kind of stay on the lookout for that. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time here at Zorpazorp Gaming. Cheers, guys.